I think we have to be vigilant
Yeah.
for those kinds of things. I mean, one of the areas that I work in the U.S. is on police surveillance and helping people not get surveilled by the police, because I have those kinds of concerns.
Yeah.
I mean, we're in the same on the same side in that issue of worrying about surveillance by the government of people who want to exercise their free speech rights.
Today, we're fortunate to have one of our Twitter critics here with us to talk about El Salvador and Bitcoin and kind of what he sees happening here with the government. Tim has a long history here in El Salvador, maybe longer than me. I'm not sure. Give us a little bit of your background about how long you've been here in El Salvador.
Sure. My first visit to El Salvador was 2001.
So you were here before me. Couple of years.
And so it started with visiting El Salvador, and then a couple years later, 2004, I started writing what had this great name. It was called Tim's El Salvador blog, and it was and is an English language website blog for people to learn about what's going on in El Salvador. So it was really started out and still is this English language source of information, and I've been writing about news and politics from El Salvador for, this will be my 20th year in 2024 since I started writing.
And you were kind of back and forth. Sometimes you were living down here, sometimes you were in the U.S.
Yeah, so it started actually with a church relationship with a church here in El Salvador, and we'd made some mission trips and different visits down here over time. But then more and more as I started writing, my trips started getting longer and longer in duration, and they were more and more frequent, closer and closer in time, and now it feels like we're almost living here about half time and half time back in the United States.
So did you feel like you kind of fell in love with the country, or was it more of a mission-driven decision to spend time here, or kind of both, or what?
Hey, I fell in love with the country just after I got off the plane in 2001. We were greeted by a group of people from our sister church community. They had filled up a whole school bus to come and greet us at the airport at that time. And I always tell the story this way. The bus was completely full when it arrived at the airport, and then we had a group. My whole family came down. We had about 15 people who then piled into the bus, and so there was a little girl, probably about 4 or 5, who sat on my lap. And at that time, my Spanish was really pretty limited. I hadn't spoken Spanish in about 20 years, but and she certainly didn't speak any English, but there was still, I grinned the whole way up on the drive from the airport. So it really was love at first sight with El Salvador for me.
So I came across your blog pretty early on because we moved here 2004. I think we bought our place in 2005. And, anytime I would search, there wasn't much available on El Salvador
Sure.
at that time. So,
Yeah.
So your blog would come up and a lot of interesting things. And I was like, definitely tell you were left-leaning, that our politics wouldn't align. And then I think I found out last time we got together you were a lawyer for the ACLU. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, so sort of my career path, I did 30 years as a business trial lawyer,
Okay.
just doing lawsuits for businesses, and that overlapped with the start of my coming to El Salvador. But then about 8 years ago, I left that private practice and in the U.S. Yes, I'm a lawyer at the American Civil Liberties Union, handling civil rights lawsuits.
So what happened with them and free speech? Because I was always a fan of them when they were hardcore free speechers, but they now they seem to have gone the other direction. What's your take on that?
I'm not sure that I would agree with you that we've varied from that. Free speech is complicated in the U.S., but the American Civil Liberties Union's been in front of the Supreme Court in the last several terms on different free speech cases, arguing for free speech. It depend on the context in what.
They used to go defend Nazis and people they totally disagreed with because they thought it was so important to have free speech be represented. There's definitely been a shift of them saying no, there's hateful speech or there's dangerous speech. I wouldn't say they have the.
There are still. I can't discuss a lawsuit that I just learned about, but there are still situations of the ACLU representing groups whose speech I find hateful and wrong. Another thing that's happened in recent years is the growth of what you might call law firms, public interest law firms on the right, where groups who are more aligned with their issues can go and get representation, whereas perhaps in the past the ACLU was the only organization out there. But I'd push back on the idea that we do not advocating for free speech.
All right. Well, I that's what I like to hear. Free speech is crucial, regardless if we agree with the people or not.
Well, I agree with that, and that's one of the challenges in this country. While the president says that he does not and has not locked up anybody for their speech, to have the head of the government openly attacking the press and regularly denigrating it is a challenge to free speech kinds of issues. But we digress.
Well, I think that's part of what we're here to talk about today.
Yeah.
So, I know that's been something that the accusations have been made is that Bukele's trying to suppress the press. I'm kind of shocked by that because have you felt personally in danger at all or concerned for yourself? You're a frequent critic of the government and the president, and
certainly there have been times when there have been internet trolls who have, and you see them too. It's not as if Bitcoiners are immune from having trolls go after them online. There was at one point where a particular fairly high-ranking politician in the government, posted an attack against me, and then all of a sudden there were all sorts of other people piling on. But I've got a pretty thick skin, and I just don't read those. So.
But because I've traveled quite a bit, and I've been to places where people are afraid to voice their views. You try to talk about something, and they totally go the other direction. Or when you're going into the airport, they're searching to make sure you don't have video recording devices. El Salvador does not feel at all like that to me. It feels like the critics of the president are free to be outspoken. I don't see really. I have a hard time with that accusation that they're really being suppressed.
There are certain things. So, let's take the what I think is the pretty well-documented instance of reporters for El Faro, an investigative news site, award-winning news site, where I think at least 14 of their reporters had their phones infected with Pegasus spyware. Now, that is spyware sold by an Israeli firm that only sells it, they say, to government entities. And El Faro, clearly has been a news outlet that has exposed issues that the government perhaps didn't want exposed. And so the valid question is, if you have software installed on the phones of critics of the government, and it is software that's only sold to governments, who was behind it? The Inter-American.
Do you think that the U.S. government has ever done that before?
Do I think the U.S. government? Sure. I work for the ACLU. We sue the U.S. government over these kinds of issues all the time. I think
could it possibly have been the U.S. government that installed it on El Faro?
That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. I mean, in terms of, what's in it for the U.S. government?
They seem to want to know what's going on with everybody.
But it would make a lot more sense for the current government. And
but when you say that that's kind of the norm in this world, that most countries' governments, or it's not unusual. I don't know whether El Salvador was involved with that or not, but I just always assume every government is doing that in their own country, including in the U.S.
I think we have to be vigilant for those kinds of things. I mean, one of the areas that I work in the U.S. is on police surveillance and helping people not get surveilled by the police, because I have those kinds of concerns. Yeah. I mean, we're in the same on the same side in that issue of worrying about surveillance by the government of people who want to exercise their free speech rights.
They did one of the HRF, Human Rights Foundation, they did one of their conferences I was at. They had a seminar basically on that, and they had people there that could check, because there was a lot of different rights advocates there, and so they actually, you could give over your phone, and a lot of them did have, from around the world, had Pegasus installed on their phone during that time.
Yeah, so governments definitely, it's not always the bad guys that they are spying on, right?
Yeah. No, I'm 100% against anything like that. I just think we need to look at the broader picture, and if we're going to hold one government and say that they're persecuting the press, then another government's doing the same thing. We should have the same accusations for them. I think sometimes El Salvador is held up unfairly in that regard, that if they do anything that everybody else is doing, that they're criticized for it, while we kind of turn a blind eye to what the other countries are doing.
I think it's definitely important to apply the same criteria to both governments. It always makes me laugh when I will write something that may be critical of the Salvadoran government, and people will say, but the U.S. government does that, as if that's somehow an attack against me, because I spend a lot of time criticizing the U.S. government for doing those things.
No, I'm definitely not an advocate for whataboutism, but I do think we need to, at least keep it in context of, hey, these are things that are happening everywhere. Let's hold everybody to the same standard.
Sure.
But I would say beyond that, I know there's a number of reporters who've said that they had to seek asylum in the U.S. I question whether that was just them taking advantage of the situation to get a residency visa in the U.S. I didn't see really anything from the government compared to other places I've been, as far as them really going after people, jailing them, persecuting their businesses, those sorts of things. And so I'm just always perplexed when people say that Bukele is suppressing the press.
I think I would put it this way, which is the level of antagonism toward the press for doing the work of the press is troubling and leads to attacks, particularly for women journalists. And the level of abuse that they get in online spaces is highly troubling. And it is true that a number of women journalists felt that they were not safe in El Salvador. Now, they weren't necessarily saying that they were afraid they were going to be arrested, but they felt that they needed, for the safety of their families or others, that they needed to leave. So, it is an atmosphere created by a government that spends a lot of time accusing the press of, they have accused the press of being in league with the gangs, of the press wanting to harm the Salvadoran public. And, the press is such an important part of maintaining transparency and putting checks and balances on a government in a democracy that it does a real disservice to the public to have the press attacked by public officials in the way that it happens here in El Salvador.
I definitely agree with that, but I would also say that the press, specifically places like El Faro, have very much politicized themselves and have not been neutral on subjects. And I've talked to people even off record with El Faro, and they said even their biggest fear, their concern with Bitcoin was not that it wasn't going to be good for El Salvador, but that it would be good for El Salvador and Bukele would get the credit for it. Like, there was this sense of them generally wanting bad things to happen so that it would reflect badly on the president. And so I think it's coming from both sides. There's definitely an antagonistic relationship coming from El Faro that I don't think you saw in the past with past administrations. They definitely weren't going after the FMLN like they have been going after Bukele.
Oh, sure they were. I mean, I remember really well the El Faro article about the black bags of cash of the Funes government, coming out of the, El Faro had was the one that released the video of the Arena politicians negotiating with the gangs at the time of the 2014 election. It's El Faro who broke a lot of the corruption stories about Funes and about Saca before him. El Salvador, has not had a good history.
No, 100%
of clean presidents,
100%.
right?
And I think we need investigative and journalists. Maybe I'm taking it more personally because they've done some hit pieces on us with very inaccurate information and slanting things, and so I'm like, okay, if they're saying these things that I know are untrue, it makes me curious how many other things that they're reporting as truth aren't truth. So maybe that's my own bias.
And I think to the extent there are things that they need to correct, you're right. That accuracy is important. What I have seen repeatedly from this government is never taking on the facts in an article, but instead attacking the messenger, right?
Yeah.
So perfect example is like this Barclays financial analysis from like 2 days ago or the day before. And the attack from the president on the Barclays financial analysis is Barclays has a Soros person on their board, so that's why they're attacking, as opposed to addressing the facts and the analysis in the Barclays report. And the one important takeaway from that report was the amount of borrowing that the Salvadoran government is doing from the Salvadoran pension system, right? I mean, it's, and this happens with governments all over the world, including the U.S. government, finding that public pension systems or social security systems are a piggy bank for which to borrow from and fund other things. And those facts haven't been engaged in by President Bukele, by Max and Stacy, who put out things attacking Barclays. And instead, it's attack the messenger as opposed to dealing with the facts. And there's so much of that goes on, that a story comes out that reveals uncomfortable truths or reveals some corruption, and instead of saying, here's where you got the facts wrong, it's attack the messenger.
No, I think that's the general direction, not just here, but everywhere. I think in this space with the Twitter world and those things, unfortunately, it's the one-liners that usually win the argument rather than getting into the details.
Yeah, you're right. And that's why I appreciate your invitation to, a civil engagement and, exchange of views and stuff, because there's so little of that that still goes on, right? And so I appreciate, you inviting me here to talk today.
No, I like delving into the issues, and it's fun trading barbs on Twitter. I have a very thick skin. My wife can't be on Twitter. She's like, but I find it enjoyable, and so, but I think that's different than being able to, like you said, sit down and kind of dig through, and so. Yeah,
and I've been nicer to you since I met you.
So you wrote this article, New Crypto Colonialists Claim to have found freedom in El Salvador. So I don't know if you know this, but the worst thing you can do to a Bitcoin person is call them a crypto person. So if you were trying to insult us off the bat, that was it's a little inside baseball. But there's within that world, there's the people that are in Bitcoin and then the crypto people, and they definitely are two different camps. So, but curious as to what brought you to write this article.
Sure.
Because it's funny that initially the criticisms I kept hearing from people was like, Bitcoin's not really impacting El Salvador. It's not bringing tourists to El Salvador. It's not bringing businesses to El Salvador. Now it seems to be, okay, it's doing all those things, but it's not helping still. So I'd be curious as to your take.
Yeah, right. So the article is not, an article about Bitcoin adoption in El Salvador as such. I mean, I've written plenty about that, and we can talk about that at a different time.
Didn't we get you set up with a Bitcoin wallet last time you were here?
I mean, I've used a Bitcoin wallet. I have bought drinks at a bar with a Bitcoin wallet. I have put minutes on my cell phone with Bitcoin. I have bought a tourist visa with Bitcoin. So I understand how to do transactions on the Lightning Network, and I even know kind of what that means.
Nice.
So I get those things. But so one of the things I noticed in the last 6 months to a year were a lot of people on on social media, YouTube, on Twitter and elsewhere, proclaiming that they had arrived in El Salvador and it was the land of freedom. I mean, and there were people who were also sitting at this table and talking to you and proclaiming about the freedom that they had found. And so I wrote this article to say that when you say El Salvador is a land of freedom, as somebody who's come and set up shop, you're leaving a big parenthetical that needs to be said out, and that is, it's a land of freedom for those of you who arrive from the north with a source of income or with a background of assets, who have a college education. And for you, I understand that you may be experiencing this as a land where you feel free. But that is not the experience, and that is not the reality for the vast majority of the Salvadoran people. And
so just real quick, just to make sure we're talking about the same issue, I think there's two separate issues. One is freedom, one is level of lifestyle and economic advantage that comes from coming from a place where the salaries are much higher from here. So I know sometimes they can be lumped together, but I do think they're two separate issues.
They're two, but they are interrelated, right? I mean, so one of the things I talk about in the article is that El Salvador, for it'll be 2 solid years later this month, has been under what's called the state of exception, which is a suspension of basic protections under the Salvadoran Constitution. So that now you can be picked up by the police without a warrant, without an order for capture, without them observing you commit a crime, but just because they believe you were looking nervous, or because they had received a anonymous tip on a phone line. You can then be held for 15 days without any charges at all, without having access to a lawyer. And then you may have, and you're put in prison, the same prison with all the gang members who have been convicted of crimes in the past. There's no separate place where pretrial detainees are held. And so your exposure to that system is, you are much more exposed to that system if you are a person of limited means than if you are a person who has a Bitcoiner who has arrived and is living in a beach house in El Zonte or above La Libertad.
100%. But you were also previously, when the murder rates were high here, when the crime was out of control, that demographic also didn't face the same dangers that most of the population was facing too. So it's kind of on both sides of it. Like, that's what I tell people is, if I want to be careful how I speak into it, because I haven't experienced it on either side. I wasn't afraid before of my son being, assaulted, because in general, tourists were left alone. Foreigners were not extorted. And so I didn't have to worry about that. But I also now don't have to worry about him being, held up and being searched by the police and possibly going to jail. It's very unlikely that that's going to happen. But I think for the average Salvadorans, both those risks were very high. Previously, it was very high that they were going to face danger from the gangs. Now they're exposed to the police, but it seems like the vast majority of them prefer the danger from the police versus the old system.
Yeah, I think you're making a really important point here. I mean, you and I living here, we had the benefits of, what's called in the United States white privilege, right? I mean, it was foreigner privilege or whatever kind of privilege it was. But, we lived in private houses. We drove our own cars. We didn't have to rely on the public transportation system. And,
even there was an unwritten rule against harming foreigners because
exactly.
It would cause more problems for the gang, so it was kind of hands off.
Exactly. I mean, in some of the really dangerous years, 2009, 10, up to 2015, people would ask me, should I travel to El Salvador? Do you feel afraid? And I would say, and this was true from 2004, and I haven't kept track recently, but I think it's still true. From 2004, when I started writing El Salvador Perspectives, till today, the only U.S. citizen with a passport who I knew being murdered in El Salvador was one guy who was killed by his ex-wife. I mean, it just was not. You were not at risk in the way that. So many people, I mean, I know tragically too many Salvadorans who were murdered by the gangs. I've been beside the casket consoling a mother whose son was killed by the gangs. And I spend a lot of time in marginalized communities that were controlled by the gangs in the past. And it is, night and day what El Salvador experiences today in those communities in terms of the heavy hand of the gangs being lifted off those communities. And, we can't minimize that impact. That is an important impact. And I'm always going to stand on the side of the victims, right? I mean, the governments in the past were not doing their job to protect people from the gangs. I mean,
remember here people were afraid to report to the police because a lot of the police would then tell the gang members that they had reported
absolutely.
them. So.
There was that kind of corruption. You had political parties that were willing to pay off the gangs for votes. All of those things are true and problematic. I think where I differ from the current government is that you are also a victim if you are an innocent person who has been picked up and thrown into the hellholes, which are Salvadoran prisons, right? And without a system for due process and separating the guilty from the innocent in any meaningful way right now. And it's
so I would love to spend some time on this and delve into it, because this is something that I've thought a lot about, because I struggle with it too. It's like, for sure that there's innocent people in the jail, but even the concept of innocent, like, what does that mean? Because it was so messy here. Even, seeing in El Zonte, there was the gang members, there was the like helpers of the gangs that were like seen as friendly, that would serve as lookouts. There was all these different levels. Some of them were forced into the gangs, and so it's like, do you hold them culpable because they were forced into the gang? At the same time, it was like the 12, 13-year-olds that were the trigger men a lot of times. And I would hear these stories from my kids growing up in this community. They knew way more that was going on than I did. And so I feel like even if you were to take all of the gang members that have been arrested and put them through a U.S.-style judicial trials, 90+% of them wouldn't be able to be convicted because you wouldn't have that beyond a shadow of a doubt. People wouldn't be willing to testify against them. You wouldn't have that. So the majority of them would have to go free during that, even though most of them, they have the tattoos, they have the other things. So how would you... Bukele did what people said was impossible. Even when that first happened, everybody thought, when we met a couple years ago, you said, well, let's see, other governments have talked about this, but it never really works out. Well, obviously we're still in the middle of it, but it's looking like this is becoming more and more permanent. So in such a messy situation where such a huge portion of the population was involved in the gangs, how do you kind of cut the legs out from underneath without having this kind of broad roundup, anybody with tattoos, anybody affiliated? You're just... Because what it's done is, it used to be kind of cool to join the gangs. It was like, you got cred if you were in the gang. There was not much downside. So you had probably 10, 20,000 young people every year entering the gangs, basically throwing their lives away. Now that pipeline has been cut out. Nobody wants anything to do with the gangs. They don't want any association. It used to be there was benefits to having association. Now the negatives outweigh. And so not only do we have less people being murdered, we have tens of thousands of young people being saved from that way of life, but as of a cost of having it done in such a messy way. But do you think there's another way that it could have been accomplished?
I think history is going to have to tell us that. What Bukele's approach was really an acknowledgement of how I don't know if incompetent is the right word, but how ineffective the criminal justice system was in this country.
Well, it was just so endemic. It was so intertwined everywhere.
Well, only like 5% of murders were ever solved, right? Or ever led to somebody being convicted and imprisoned. That's how poor the government was at being able to investigate and handle murders. So essentially, part
of that was that nobody wanted to testify, because we would see that here. There'd be things, and people are like, "No, I'm not testifying," because if you testify, they're going to kill you. They're going to kill your family members, and so
because the government had no way to protect witnesses, all of those kinds of things. So you had you had that. So essentially, the state of exception is sort of saying, so we're going to lower the bar so far down that basically, it's if you are associated with the gang, we'll put you away for 30 years, right? That's essentially, we're not going to worry about proving murders or extortions or any individual crimes. It will be enough to say you are a member of a gang. And of course, that sweeps up people who are, as you said, may themselves sort of be victims. They were collaborators, or they were somebody who would, in a little three-wheeled scooter, transport gang members from one place to another, because if not, their sister was going to be raped. So they were doing that. Are they a collaborator? Are they a victim? Right now, the government is saying you're a collaborator and you're in prison. In El Salvador, we are where we are, right? But let's look for a way to distinguish the people in prison and make those kinds of determinations.
But how would you? I know even people here in El Zonte that I never would have thought were involved. And you talk to the people, they're like, So if you're in a town, you could have even people that know the people disagree whether or not they were involved. How is a judicial system that's far removed, that knows none of the background story and just has very limited reports, like how would you even make those decisions on who is guilty and who's not? Other than like, hey, you have the tattoos, you're obviously were part of the gang life, you're going to jail.
I think you can't give up on trying. I think the government has bought into it's one. The government's narrative is, you know, we make very few mistakes, and we've got all the right people in there, and so there's not much acknowledgement of that possibility. I think you have to at least try to create a system. It may not work and may not be appropriate that it be a system that involves jury trials and all the trappings of that the United States, for example, can afford in its judicial system. But right now, you have a government that doesn't really seem to even be attempting to have a process to select them out.
I know that they've said that they've released thousands. Obviously, I don't know the daily, action as far as that goes. And we, I think, would be in agreement of going forward of what should be done. I'm curious, as your thought, was there initial like overwhelming force go in and round up everybody the correct way to do it, even acknowledging that there was collateral damage? Because I have a hard time with it, but I don't think you could have cut the legs out from underneath it. The way they were doing it before, they would recruit new gang members faster than they could arrest them. And so I don't know. It's almost like a wartime scenario where you have to go in with this overwhelming force and then clean it up later. But I don't know if you have a different take on that.
I am not an expert in policing and knowing was there a better way. I don't see myself saying it's fine to pick up. I know people who I'm very certain are innocent people. I know their families. I know how hard this kid worked to stay out of the gangs.
Yeah.
And yet they're in prison. And I can't say sweeping that young man up in this was ever going to be justified. That being said, it is, we can't deny that, in communities all across the country, people are feeling safer. That is an important thing to acknowledge in these discussions. But the other thing you're doing is also putting people who, if you're going to acknowledge that, yes, we are sweeping up some innocent people as well, then you've got a moral and other obligation to make a serious attempt, one, to find ways to separate the innocent and get them released, but also not to violate their human rights while you are incarcerating them. Remember that the bulk of these 75,000 plus people who have been arrested have not yet even been convicted of being gang members, right? They're being held pre-trial. I'm not sure that there have been any trials as such, as understood in the Salvadoran criminal justice system. I mean, these people are still going to be tried eventually.
I think there's been. I don't know if there've been trial. I know there's been releases. So
yeah, there have been some releases that relate to pressure by community groups or lawyers, or there are plenty of good, upstanding people within the police department who, will say, "Look, I was the community police officer in this area, and I know this young person, and and will help, in that kind of way where a person with the right connections and other kinds of things may be may be released."
So question for you. If they gave you the lever and said, "Tim, you can pull the lever and release all the people that were swept up in this and haven't been tried yet," would you pull that lever and release them?
What, all 70,000 people? No, there are plenty of people for whom there is proof that they were engaged in criminal activity and are danger to their community and others who ought to be held pending a trial.
But do you think there should be the trial? Getting back to what I was talking about earlier, like trial based on, beyond reasonable doubt, because most of those would go free in that style of trial. Like the purpose of a penal system is twofold. One is to bring justice for people who have been perpetrated crimes, but it's also as a deterrence to deter people from committing crimes. And so, do you think in this messy, complicated situation that it might be more beneficial for society as a whole to say, hey, we're never going to be able to figure this out person by person, but now we've set this deterrence in place. The majority of these people, even if you knew all the facts, half the people would say that they were innocent, half would say they're guilty because it's just messy. They were kind of forced to do it, but then they became perpetrators. Like,
ask the mother of the young person who's imprisoned in that hellhole, who she spent 17 years doing everything she could to keep him out of the gangs, and now she's been deprived of her child and hasn't been able to have it.
It's horrific.
So,
but even a lot of those mothers would, and I've talked to these people who have family members in jail, they still are not against the state of exception. They think their family member was wrongly picked up, but they still are for the security measures as a whole, even with that fact, which is surprising to me. I'm always shocked by that. But they say, no, I'm for what Bukele's doing, but my brother is innocent, and we need to get him out of there.
Yeah, and I think if you ask people to drill down, I mean, there was a poll by the University of Central America, and asking people, are you in favor of the state of exception and the war on gangs? And broadly, it's 90%, right?
Yeah.
But when you ask, like, are you in favor of the presumption of innocence, or are you in favor of individual things that
everybody always wants it both ways.
That are suspended. So there are these complicated questions about, the criminal justice system. And the other thing about the state of exception, and this kind of gets back to maybe it is too simplistic to say El Salvador is the land of freedom or liberty, but the state of exception applies to being picked up for anything. Not just for being picked up as a gang member. And so, there is the example of 6 activists in Cabañas Department very involved in activism against gold mining in the area and protection of water. And they were picked up and charged with being involved in a woman who was killed in, I think it's like 1980 or 1978 during the war conflict. And they were held under the state of exception for more than a year, with a very large international campaign to get them released, because the proof of their having any connection with it was very, very limited. And the irony of this is that the military colonels and generals who were clearly responsible for giving the order for massacres of women and children at El Misused are being processed, outside. They are allowed to live their, aging years in freedom, not being held. But these water activists who, the strong suspicion is that the government is showing this is what can happen to you if you get too involved in political activism against something that we as the government may want to do. So one of the issues is that the state of exception is held out as this tool against the gangs, but it can also be used against political opponents, people who are just, it's a little bit too uncomfortable for the things that they are saying about the government.
No, I definitely am. Like I said, I've wrestled through these things, but the longer that goes on, the more I feel like, okay, it's time to end the state of exception.
It does seem a little bit weird to say that we're in El Salvador and there's a state of emergency, and at the same time the president saying this is the safest country in the Western Hemisphere. Well, then what's the ongoing emergency that justifies suspending all of these constitutional rights?
Yeah. No, I'm with you there. I think that's something to wrestle through. Some of the other things you addressed in the article was along the freedom line was how El Salvador had dealt with COVID.
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, that I think was one of the things that I gave me more of a chuckle, and sort of some of these folks don't know a whole lot of the El Salvador's recent history, and the way, when COVID struck, the very strong lockdown that El Salvador imposed. I mean, you were here, or maybe
I was here.
And so when only one family member can leave the household, and only to go to certain places, and if not, you could be put in a contention center, and there wasn't any due process with that, right? You'd be locked up away, and when too many people were enjoying the beach area in Puerto Libertad, have a military siege of the whole things, or the Salvadorans who were stranded outside of the country and not allowed to come back to the country during the lockdown period.
No, my friends had classmates that, like, their mom flew to Miami to go shopping for the weekend and was like stuck there for 6 months.
So it makes me laugh, to sort of hear some of these people who arrive and can I call them Bitcoiners?
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
whoever they, whatever they
well,
are.
I think a lot of them they weren't here during that time. They didn't experience it, and I was a vocal critic of the. The ironic thing was these procedures were very popular. I mean, people in general were very much for them. I mean, I felt like I was the only one saying this is crazy, but they were. I mean, we had here on the coast, people were cutting down palm trees so that people couldn't cross the road. I remember when they were hiring coyotes to sneak them back in, and people were online saying they should shoot them if they cross the border illegally. And I thought, well, that's a little ironic considering the history of El Salvador. But they were, with the general public, these were very popular. But for me, it was, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's I think, a love of the sort of the strongman figure for running and President Bukele was, certainly portraying himself, not just portraying, he was acting as the strongman who was
politically astute. He saw that was the worldwide at that time. It was popular to come very harsh, but he also turned things around much quicker than most countries did. He loosened things up quicker. He got rid of the one thing that killed me was how long it kept the schools closed. But the other things that they did, they're one of the first countries to open back up. They did a lot of the right things coming out of it, but coming into it, no, they were definitely very strict.
Right, because the schools, for 2020, all of 2021 were all online. And then 2022 was half and half. Yeah. Right, half online and half in person.
I remember I had to take my daughter in the middle of the night. She had some issue with her eye. We had to go to the hospital diagnosticos in the middle of the night, and we're leaving there at like 2 a.m. We drive by, and there's the strip club there, and it's like full of cars. And I was so irate. I'm like, we still have the schools closed, but the strip clubs are open. Yeah. Like, what's wrong with our priorities here? So that was definitely, I felt like they handled that part poorly, the educational component. The other things, they opened back up, and I felt like did a better job than other places.
Yeah, and I think, I've written with sort of, that there were a lot of things that I thought the Salvadoran government did well during the management of COVID. They went overboard on some of these lockdown things, but a lot of the public health messaging and different ways that they dealt with the pandemic were solid. I think the point I sort of want to make here about is, the level of freedom or liberty in El Salvador is that those powers that Nayib Bukele exercised during that time are not ones that in any way, shape, or form he has renounced as something that he doesn't have going forward if he needs to exercise them. But
in all fairness, no other governments that went overboard have either. So
that's right. But people are saying, we're fleeing those other governments to find our level of freedom. I think specifically around
here in El Salvador. There was no COVID vaccine mandate here, which I think was for a lot of people, especially a lot of Canadians, was something that they were fleeing. So they didn't see the first part of it, but they saw how those things were being handled later on, and it fit with what they were looking for. So, but I agree with you. I think there is, it's maybe not.
Yeah, it's
being a little just seeing the plus sides and not the negatives.
Yeah. So I think there are so there are those issues. I think, if we talk about Chivo wallet,
Oh yeah, let's
for a
talk about
second?
Chivo Wallet.
I'm going to guess you weren't a fan of it. I mean,
I was actually not against it in principle. I'm not against their, as long as there's other alternatives and that people could choose the wallets that they would use. But the way they've done things and rolled things out, it's been a fiasco. And so I wanted it to succeed. I wanted it to work well, but it's.
yeah. But one of my biggest concerns about Chivo Wallet was the privacy aspect of it,
100%.
right? Did you want the government of El Salvador to know every single transaction you were doing, because that's what you were giving if you adopted Chivo Wallet?
Yeah.
And that I think that goes to show that Bukele hasn't bought into all of the values that the Bitcoin community espouses.
I think you could look at it that way. I think it could be just a pragmatism. He was getting pushed by the U.S. government, by the IMF, that this is going to facilitate all kinds of money laundering and terrorist financing, and so there was an extent that they had to do KYC AML procedures if they were going to do any type of wallet that they were involved with. And so I don't think that there was a way for them to really get around with that. The other thing, from talking to the people I know in the space, and that actually was very prevalent with Chivo, is companies have to KYC AML because of the fraud issues, and there's so much online fraud that if they don't do that, they just get ripped off right and left, like the Salvadoran government did with the $30 that they did. So I'm not in favor of it by any means, but I don't necessarily think that. I think they thought maybe their hands were tied, that this was just came with the territory. So.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it's interesting that you're so willing to give the government of El Salvador a benefit.
I don't use the Chivo wallet.
Right.
So.
Yeah. But I think, I think we need to be as concerned and doubting about the bona fides of, what this government would do with a bunch
100%.
of data. In the same way that if you get a Salvadoran cell phone, the amount of data that your cell phone company is required to get from you when you sign up and then give to the government about the person who holds this particular phone number is another privacy violation.
I agree. But a lot of that stuff is stuff that's pushed by the U.S. government, because they claim that, if you don't do this, there's terrorism financing, there's all these different things that go along with that. So I know for sure on the financial side, from talking to people in the banking system here, majority of that stuff is done to not get gray listed by the U.S. government and kicked off the SWIFT system. Like, that is the biggest fear of what's happening. Now, that's not to say that they're not using this data for other stuff. I don't know. I'm always suspicious of anybody that wants my data.
Well,
so, yeah.
And should we have systems against terrorism financing?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Because they're not effective. That's the reality. KYC, AML policies, the terrorists and the criminals, they always find a way around them. But what it does is cause the majority of the people in the world to remain outside of the financial system, because it costs too much for the companies to KYC and AML poor people. And so they just exclude them. And so what we've done is we've marginalized half the world, and the terrorists and the criminals they always find a way to make it happen. I mean, that's the reality. And so in theory, it sounds good, but in practice, I mean, when they looked at, I think it was the FACTA law that they passed in the US, and it was going to raise, I don't know, hundreds of billions of dollars in taxes and whatever. They finally came out and looked. It was $100 in cost for every dollar that they recouped in taxes. And those costs were borne by all the banks. So what the banks did around the world is they just said, well, if you're American, we don't want you as a customer anymore. So it's those unintended consequences that kind of ripple out. And that's why, obviously I'm not for terrorism financing, but I don't want to make 1 billion people stay impoverished because we might stop one transaction from growing through, that they're going to find another way. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the reality.
Yeah, and I'm complete agreement about the need to reduce transaction costs and to streamline, and to the extent fintech makes that easier and faster and lowers transaction costs and lowers barriers to entry, so that people can be banked.
Do you have a bank account here?
I do.
How have you found using the banking system here?
It's better now than it was, right? But no, it's a pain in the,
I don't have the patience for it. I mean, it is, yeah.
I mean, I've experienced that there's more and more stuff that is now able to be done online in ways that didn't used to be. I mean, some of the online payment systems are getting better. But I also recognize that, I've got a set of skills in terms of working through an online banking system that your average vendor of pupusas does not have, right? And so, but yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that El Salvador has, and I give credit to the Bukele government because I do think that they are managing to reduce some of the levels of red tape and hassles in engaging in a lot of different kinds of activities that before took multiple stupid trips to stupid agencies where you would sit in a long line and waste half of your day just to find that you needed a different signature with a rubber stamp seal.
It was almost like they wanted to find a reason to say no because they're afraid if they said yes, they might get in trouble. And so even if they told you needed this, this, and this, then they would come up like, oh, but you don't have that. It was like this weird, I was just like, but I feel like that's gotten much better. Now I feel like actually now when I go back to California and try to do stuff there, I'm sometimes feel like, wow, I feel like El Salvador gets things done faster than it does here. So
yeah,
it's, so would you say, I know you've always been a very vocal critic of the president, but would you say that overall that the direction of El Salvador has gone in the last 5 years has been a positive one, or do you feel like they're going backwards, or what's your assessment of El Salvador right now?
So there are multiple different directions, right? I mean, in terms of the rule of law in the country, I think it's going in the wrong direction. I mean, it is simply the case that El Salvador's constitution, and it's not even close, in multiple places said that the president can't be reelected. And despite that, he ran for reelection. How did he get to do that? His party, Nuevas Ideas, on May 1st of 2021, fired the existing constitutional chamber and put in five allies. There is a very explicit description in the Constitution of how you elect and put in place magistrates of the Constitutional Chamber. It was not followed. And so we have a government right now.
It was followed, but under unusual procedures. They had enough votes to basically impeach or to throw out the existing.
Well, so there were two parts. So getting rid of the existing constitutional chamber, I mean, there was, remember, I mean, it's a process that you impeach them within, in 3 hours or 4 hours on that night without any evidence or proof of any wrongdoing by the existing constitutional chamber other than a dislike.
But they had the votes. They had the votes to do that.
They had the votes, but the Constitution says on what basis you can.
And they had a basis, and the people vote, whether or not you think that was a valid basis. There was a procedure that they followed. Now, were they pushing the envelope? Maybe, but there was a procedure to get rid of them, and they followed that because they had the votes. Just the same way that the Democrats or the Republicans would stack the Supreme Court in the U.S. if they had 90% of the Senate and the House.
Right. So you have the you have the votes, but the votes say you have the Constitution says there are certain reasons that you can remove for, and there was never any introduction of here is the evidence that those reasons existed. But despite that, they voted. And then the Constitution says to put people on the constitutional chamber, they need to come from a list from the Judicial Council. I don't remember the exact name of the bodies that provide the list of qualified persons. That process was completely ignored. I mean, there 10 minutes after you've impeached the other ones, you are electing five new people. Clearly, there was not a lot of discussion, debate, analysis, evaluation of the credentials of the 5 people that were put in.
No, but anytime one party has that degree of supermajority, whether it's in the system here, a system in the U.S., those type of things happen. I mean, that's the way politics plays out.
That doesn't mean that I can't critique it as
100%.
And Salvadorans can't critique it as this is yes, you played pure power politics, and by the way, that violates what our Constitution says. To which the players who have the power say, yeah, but who's going to tell us we can't? And that's what's going on now in El Salvador. So the rule of the rule of law, suspending the Constitution for 2 straight years now, and saying that there is an emergency that has long since passed, since the president tells us this is the safest country in the Americas.
I mean, I agree with you, but I do think you could make an argument that this has been so recent that they need to make sure it's cemented in place, because it could easily reverse itself. And so I think there's an argument that this needs to be seen through, and they don't want to short step it. Now, I wouldn't make that argument, but I think there's at least some validity for it.
I think anybody those are after the fact kind of justifications. People at the time would have said these are for emergencies. These are for the system is under attack right now. There's mainly a section to deal with natural disasters, and it was used during the pandemic,
Yeah.
and different kinds of things. But right now, the police are not being shot at by the gangs. The people are not being extorted. People are not being murdered. So where's the state of it? The state of emergency that requires
No,
that.
I would agree that
So-
it's
so-
time to.
Right. So yes, my analysis of the country. So you have that one piece. The second piece, I would say, is the lack of transparency by this government. The declaring so much public information about how taxpayers' money gets used, spent, even the number of people who were hospitalized with COVID, or the number of tests that were being used, or the national plan of health, or even, and I was really troubled by this, there was an audit report done of the internet voting that the Supreme Electoral Tribunal has said, no, that's confidential information that can't be disclosed, whether there were any problems with the internet voting system. So, I know you guys like to say trust but verify. Well, you can't verify if the government won't give you any access to information. What's the proof that the government has bought the number of bitcoins
Zero
that
proof.
it says, right?
Zero proof.
Yeah.
Other than if you say that you've done it and then you haven't, it's going to look really bad, like, for you when it comes out. So I don't know. I don't know why they would make the claim if it wasn't true. But no.
Why not? Right? Why not disclose the address of where the Bitcoin are? Is there even a pattern of a single Bitcoin address doing one a day every day since?
The different rumors were that it was custodied by some firm in the U.S., which has its own problems and criticism within the specifically within the Bitcoin space, if that's happening. But yeah, there's lots of there's.
How much money has the government spent on operating the Chivo wallet system?
No idea.
We have no idea. How much money in the $150 million trust fund that was set up at the time to back the interchangeability of dollars to Bitcoin and back and forth. What's the status of that? When the president said the Chivo Pets Hospital was built with Bitcoin profits, but says he's never sold a single Bitcoin, how does that work?
Yeah, I think that was more of a just like, I think at that time their Bitcoin earnings were up, and so it was a.
Yeah, so that's the thing, right? There is so much.
There's
much non-transparency.
Yeah. There's politics
by this
and
government.
but that's unfortunately that's the norm in general. But if you look at the numbers overall, they for the amount of money that they've spent on the Bitcoin investment versus the amount of investment and tourism and everything that's brought in, it's a winner. So it's not that they're not just. Well, I don't know what the system was before on what they disclosed, what the government disclosed on how all of that works. So I don't know if this is any different or if it's the same, but.
I would say my experience, because I could actually make, public information requests, sending an email to a different government body, just as a blogger based in the U.S. and I'd get responses. I mean, I didn't think very much of the FMLN government under Sanchez Seren, but the one thing they did do was sort of open government and respond to requests for information. The other thing that really happened with the Bukele government was the websites of the different government agencies used to be sources of information about things that were going on, or information, statistics about the travel by the minister, but they were sources of information. Now they're sources of publicity. Right? The websites are all branded in a particular way, and they are all about portraying the great things that the government is doing, as opposed to providing needed information about the number of people who are hospitalized, or the number of pupils who dropped out of the school system last year, for example. So I mean, that's really troubling, because for the democracy to work, for a president to be able to celebrate that he had 80% approval, it had better be based on the people having access to actual information, as opposed to the people having to only get their information from the government propaganda sources.
Yeah, but I think most people, I mean, maybe you and I are going to go to those sources, but most people they respond how they feel in their daily life. They're not researching those things. And I think, in general, I think the vast majority of Salvadorans feel like life is significantly better now than it was 5 years ago. And they're much more proud to be Salvadorans, and they have much more hope in the future. And so...
And that is true. And it is, I don't remember when I wrote this particular column, but, it was an important change that to see in public opinion polls Salvadorans' optimism about the country, and that's important and shouldn't be that shouldn't be denied, and to have a greater, I think those of us who study history and have a longer perspective, will say, and it's great, this story tends to have a bad ending when one person has all the power. I mean, populist autocrats start with very large election victories. That's almost what it means to be a populist. Yeah. But eventually, the chickens come home to roost, and they use these different tools that have, like a state of exception, like their control and domination of the police and the armed forces and other things, to stay in power long term. And absent, the tools that, democratic institutions have built up over time, of checks and balances, of an independent judiciary, of changing power, term limits, those kinds of things. Absent those things being in place, autocrats tend to get more autocratic, and that would be my concern of the future path that the country's on.
You do have
lots of good
examples
points.
like Singapore, of that the leader had those same criticisms, but most people now would look back and say it took this backwater country into being a very developed and first world. But I think we're in general facing. I don't know if you're familiar with Neil Howe's work at all. He wrote The Fourth Turning. He does.
I mean, I've heard of it.
Yeah.
I haven't read it.
He does a lot of stuff with just generational trends and one of the things he's saying is that he would say we're in a fourth turning, and in a fourth turning they tend to be attracted to populist leaders, that it's a time where people demand more order out of life. And I think in general, you're seeing in Latin America, there's a democracy isn't held in high esteem by the general populace. I think there's a sense that democracy has failed Latin America. And so I think that I don't agree with that, but I think that is a general sentiment. And so I think that it's going to be an interesting next 10 years to see how things play out just in the region.
Yeah, and I think it's important, for voices to continue to, express those concerns and stuff. And
we always need critics. We don't need any censorship. We need critics.
Right, and there are a lot of really brave Salvadorans out there, both independent journalists and people in human rights organizations and others who despite the criticism and stuff that they will get from the powers that be in this country, want to point out that need for democracy and checks and balances, and that try to make that education for people so that they understand the value of some of these institutions that have been built up over time, even though.
But they have not been working for them. I mean, it has been absolutely disastrous.
The fact that El Salvador's democracy failed in many ways does not mean you give up on the democratic project. Funes stole hundreds of millions. Saka stole hundreds of millions. Governments negotiated with gangs. There was plenty of corruption. Absolutely. But I don't think if you study single-party systems that you would be able to say that on balance they tend to be honest and non-corrupt.
No, I agree. I mean, from what I've seen so far, I'm hopeful, but I know those things can change over time. And but having lived here for a long time, I would say it just feels like a very different country, even than my kids grew up in. Even talking with my kids about the issues they're dealing with now from growing up here, the number of dead bodies they've seen, the really the PTSD that they have from the things that they experienced, and then talking to people who've only lived here for a year or two and just realizing what a different world is, it makes it hard for me not to be very optimistic about the direction, holding in all the concerns that we've mentioned, but optimistic about the momentum and just the general sense of national pride, and like people want to stay in El Salvador now, and it's they're building businesses here, and every flight I take, the number of people coming back who haven't been in El Salvador for 20 years that are coming back.
I mean that's both yes and no. I spent a bunch of time out in some rural communities in the eastern part of the country in January, and in a couple different communities, they both told me that more people had left in recent months than in the previous year, and largely poverty related, and a belief still in and believe me, it frequently doesn't occur. They don't achieve the quote-unquote American dream,
Yeah.
trying to cross into the United States. But that, and what they said is that the president talks about, and they acknowledged and they were thankful for the reduction in gang presence and stuff in their communities. They weren't denying that, and they said, we are happy that Bukele did that. But they were also saying that the president talks about development and stuff, but we aren't seeing that. Maybe that happens along the coast, they said. But here in the interior of Usulatan and San Miguel, it's we're not better off. Things cost more, and it is really hard. And so I think there are people, and it's why the polls say that now the number one concern people have is the economy and the high cost of living and employment.
Well, I think we've seen, from the stats I saw, the immigration was down 50% last year from the prior year. So that was a significant reduction.
So I have the stats.
Okay.
So in the last 3 years, and the only way we have stats is really the number of people
Caught
apprehended
at
the U.S. border. So the actual number is higher because there are people who are not caught. But 280,700 over the last 3 years. So that's 2021, 2022, 2023. 69,000 was the number in 2023, down from 88,000 in 2022. So, 19. So about a 20%
I thought
drop.
it was 90 something to 60 was what I had seen.
That's if you're doing sort of U.S. fiscal years,
Okay.
which end like September 30th or whatever. So
Yeah.
those were calendar
But
year,
I think you have to
year
take
numbers.
and keep in mind that all the other countries have seen a huge increase at that time. So the number of Hondurans, the number of Nicaraguans, the number of Guatemalans have gone up during that time.
That's not true for Honduras. Honduras
Are you sure?
Honduras pattern also went down. Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras generally follow a pretty similar pattern. Guatemala has diverged from that. There were 220,000 Guatemalans in 2023. Compared to 70,000 Salvadorans. But I'd have to look at the relative populations. I think Guatemala is twice the population?
Yeah, I think it's a little more than double.
Yeah, so, we'll
No,
see.
but I'm talking about from compared to prior years.
We'll see.
El Salvador used to be one of the highest. Because I know even
Bukele,
talking to people at the U.S. Embassy, they were, I can't remember her name, but the prior acting ambassador
Jean Maines.
that hated Bukele, they basically, from my understanding, pushed her out because they wanted friendly relationships with El Salvador because Bukele was reducing immigration, and that is the U.S. Embassy's number one goal in El Salvador, is reducing immigration.
It is true that the U.S. has a single focus on U.S. El Salvador relations now, which seems to be migration. But one thing, if you look over sort of the last 15-year period, and I've got the stats, I mean, Bukele's years in office, if you add up his five years, were the highest 5 years of prior presidential terms. I mean, the numbers of 90,000 a year in fiscal year. Now, it is true that 2023, the numbers came down through June of 2023. They steadily increased July through November of 2023. December and January have been down a little bit, and they always go down around the holidays. We'll see what February numbers are.
Well, and it's complicated things too, because a lot of it depends with how prevalent jobs are in the U.S.
Yep.
How easy they're hearing it is to cross or not cross in the U.S. And so there's a lot of different factors. Yeah.
Yeah. So people are still leaving. I mean, we'll see where the trends are going. The last 2 months went down. Do they go back up, or we'll see? And I tend to think that migration will continue to decline, for the reasons you've talked about, people's optimism about the country. But that is, yet to be
These
seen.
things take a while to play out.
Yeah, that's definitely.
But
the
I
case.
bet 5 years ago you wouldn't have believed if somebody told you people would pay $1 million for a Salvadoran passport.
There's a sucker born every minute.
We'll see. My theory is they're going to sell enough passports to pay off the IMF debt this year.
Let me just say that there were an awful lot of people who, for some reason, thought there was going to be a Bitcoin bond in the way that Bukele described it, that made no economic sense at all, or that thought there was going to be a Bitcoin city. I mean, he can sell a lot of snake oil.
Well, I think, I was never betting on the Bitcoin city, but I wouldn't count it out. I think some of these long-term projects, I mean, these things take a long time to play out. But I do know,
a train and a satellite.
I do know that
airport
that I sat down and did a podcast here 2 weeks ago with the head of Tether, and this is a company
I watched it.
that's making billions of dollars a year, and El Salvador is their primary focus. Like, they see potential to turn El Salvador into a financial powerhouse for the region. So, and they're not alone. So I think that these things, I think people will be shocked 5 years from now to see the changes that are coming.
Invite me back in 5 years.
All right. Perfect. Well, I appreciate you coming down, and I hope this doesn't mean that we can't still trade barbs on Twitter, because I would miss that. We need to just because we're friendly here doesn't mean we can't criticize each other on Twitter. But
that's right. And if the people who watch live from Bitcoin Beach want to get an alternative point of view, my website's
yes, we need to make sure.
Yeah, El Salvador.
Can you put that up?
El Salvador Perspectives. It's at elsalvadorperspectives.com. It's easy to find. And then, there we go.
The last one, the one that has his Twitter handle.
Right, and my Twitter handle is just at Tim Muth. And happy to
You're pretty prolific writer. How often do you publish articles?
I try to do about 10 per month.
Okay.
It kind of depends on what other things are busy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you've written. I've read a lot of interesting stuff over the years. I don't
Well,
agree
good.
with it all, but a lot of interesting stuff. So.
That's all right. I don't agree with everything that you write.
Well,
But I'm glad we could do it
Yeah.
civilly in this way, and hope we can do it again.
No, I think these are the things that need to get hashed out, and it's good to have discourse. I'm pro discourse.
All right.
I think it's always beneficial to, and a lot of times it's not even that you disagree with things. It's just life's complicated and things
It
are
is.
messy,
Yep.
and it's okay to admit that. So,
Agree.
all right. Well, thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Mike.